Hello, my name is Alicia Mendez, and for 12 years, I worked as a flight attendant for one of the most respected airlines in Europe. I love my job. The long hours, the changing skies, even the recycled air that people complain about. Every flight was a story, every passenger a new character. I used to think the sky was my home, until the day it all came crashing down because of one man who thought he could destroy me and walk away clean. It happened on a routine route from Madrid to Buenos Aires, a long-haul overnight flight. The captain that night was Mark Donovan, a man with a reputation that split the crew in two. Some called him charming, others called him dangerous. He was the kind of pilot who smiled too widely, complimented too easily, and treated authority like it was his personal game. I'd flown with him twice before, and each time I kept my distance. But that night, something felt different. He was overly friendly, asking personal questions, making small talk that edged into uncomfortable territory. I laughed it off politely and focused on my work. Halfway through the flight, during meal service, one of the passengers complained that his drink tasted off. I went to replace it, and as I passed the cockpit door, Mark called me in. He said he wanted a coffee, strong and quick. Nothing unusual. I made one and brought it in. He smiled, thanked me, and said something like, "You always take care of me, Alicia." I remember the tone. It wasn't gratitude, it was ownership. When we landed in Buenos Aires, everything seemed normal. I checked into the hotel with the crew, exhausted but relieved to be done. The next morning, I got a call from my supervisor asking me to come to the local office immediately. They said it was urgent. I thought maybe it was about a passenger complaint, maybe a scheduling issue. I had no idea it would be the end of everything I had built. They told me someone had reported that I smelled of alcohol during the flight. My heart stopped. I thought it was a joke. I told them it was impossible. They said Captain Donovan had filed a report, supported by observations from the first officer. My blood ran cold. The first officer, a young man barely 2 months into the job, probably didn't even know what he was signing. I tried to defend myself, begged them to run tests. They did, but by the time results came back clean, the damage was done. The airline suspended me immediately pending investigation. The media got wind of it. A headline read, "Flight attendant found intoxicated during international flight." My face wasn't shown, but colleagues whispered. Passengers from previous flights texted me, and my boyfriend, who was also a pilot, stopped answering my calls. He didn't even ask if it was true, just silence. I went from respected crew to gossip material overnight. In the following weeks, I fought for my name. I wrote letters, demanded an independent review, and even hired a lawyer. But it's hard to fight an accusation when the person who made it wears a captain's stripes. Pilots have power. They write the official flight reports. The airline trusted him more than me, despite my spotless record. Months went by, and my world shrank. My uniform gathered dust in my closet, and every night, I replayed the flight in my head, trying to figure out how he did it. Then, one evening, I ran into a former coworker, Clara, at a small cafe near the airport. She looked nervous, like she was about to tell me something she shouldn't. She said, "Alicia, you didn't do anything wrong. Mark did this to you." I asked her how she knew, and she said she overheard him talking to another pilot in the crew lounge, laughing about how a little payback never hurts. Apparently, I'd once filed an anonymous HR note about his inappropriate behavior toward a junior attendant, a note that led to him getting a formal warning. He never forgot. He'd been waiting for a chance to get even. That night, everything clicked. He'd asked for coffee from me specifically. He could have easily switched the cups when I turned my back. He could have added something, anything, that smelled faintly of alcohol. Then, all he had to do was file the report and watch me burn. I felt sick, betrayed, but more than that, I felt awake for the first time in months. It wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it was a calculated move. He wanted to teach me a lesson for daring to speak up. I promised myself then that I wouldn't let him win. It took almost a year for the investigation to finally clear me. The airline reinstated me quietly, with no apology, no press correction, nothing to undo the months of humiliation. But I didn't care. I had my wings back, and that meant I had access. I also had time. When I checked the new roster and saw his name next to mine on a flight to Toronto, my hands trembled, not with fear, but with something sharper. Fate had handed me the one thing I'd been craving since that cafe conversation. an opportunity. I didn't want revenge at first, not in the dramatic sense. I just wanted the truth. I wanted to see his face when he realized I wasn't the same woman he'd destroyed. I started preparing, not out of hatred, but precision. I studied the service routines, cockpit procedures, and how beverages were logged. I made sure everything I did would leave no trace of wrongdoing. If I was going to confront him, it had to be within the rules, where every detail mattered. On the day of that flight, when I saw him again in the crew briefing room, he smiled like nothing had ever happened. He even winked at me and said, "Good to see you back, Alicia. Hope you've learned to pace yourself this time." My jaw tightened, but I smiled back. I had learned to pace myself, just not in the way he thought. As we boarded the aircraft and passengers settled in, I watched him from a distance. Same routine, same cocky walk, same silver flask that he always claimed was filled with energy drink. No one ever questioned him. He was untouchable, but not for long. That flight would be the first time he'd realize what it felt like to lose control at 35,000 feet, not through malice, but through truth carefully delivered. The same truth he'd buried a year ago. And I was ready to serve it cold, like coffee on a long, sleepless night above the clouds. After that flight to Toronto, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. I was someone who'd been pushed to the edge and quietly decided to fight back, but not with chaos or anger. I wanted precision. I wanted him to fall by his own hands, the same way he made me fall by mine. I started small. Observation was my weapon now. Every crew member talks, and in our world, gossip travels faster than turbulence. I began to listen, really listen, to conversations during layovers, crew lounges, and briefings. Bit by bit, I started hearing things about Captain Donovan that confirmed what I already suspected. A flight attendant named Marissa once whispered to me that he'd cornered her during a layover in Athens. Another, Elena, said she filed a complaint after he made a crude remark mid-flight, but HR lost her report. It was always the same pattern: intimidation, followed by silence. The airline protected him because he had seniority and spotless flight hours. They saw him as an asset, not a liability. It disgusted me, but I also saw an opportunity. If the airline refused to see the truth, I'd have to show it to them in a way they couldn't ignore. Every flight with him became a study. I memorized his habits. He always carried a black thermos labeled protein shake and kept it in the cockpit near his flight bag. He'd pour it into his coffee cup halfway through long flights, pretending it was just for energy. Sometimes he'd even joke, "Don't tell anyone my secret fuel." The arrogance of that line burned into me. I never saw him actually drink alcohol in the cockpit, but I didn't need to. I just needed to understand how he operated. He was a man who thought control meant safety. He believed that as long as he manipulated the story first, he'd always stay clean. That was his weakness. At home, I started keeping notes, not the emotional kind, cold factual logs. Flight numbers, dates, his remarks, the crew members he interacted with, and subtle behavioral changes. I stored everything on a flash drive. I wasn't sure yet how I'd use it, but I knew I was building something important, something solid. One night, after a long flight to Dubai, I found myself sitting alone in the hotel bar, sipping tea. My reflection in the glass looked calm, but inside, I was burning. A young attendant named Sophia sat down beside me. We started talking about the flight, then about work in general. She hesitated before saying, "Alicia, can I ask you something? Did you really get suspended last year for drinking on duty?" The question hit like a slap. I looked at her, ready to be defensive, but her expression wasn't judgment, it was fear. "Because," she continued, lowering her voice, "the captain told people you were lucky to get your job back. He said you almost cost him his career." That's when it clicked. He was rewriting the narrative again, turning me into the villain so his image stayed clean. He wasn't just a liar, he was strategic. I realized if I wanted to expose him, I couldn't just react, I had to predict. I started researching discreetly, learning how internal airline investigations worked. Every incident, no matter how small, had to be documented officially if reported during the flight. And the captain's report carried the most weight. But there was one loophole: cockpit voice recordings. They were deleted after a set number of flight hours unless preserved due to an official report or irregularity. That gave me an idea. If I could create a situation where he made a false claim again, and the flight data was automatically preserved, I could trap him with his own words. But I couldn't just accuse him. It had to happen naturally, midair, where no one could doctor the records. Over the next few weeks, I built my plan quietly. I ordered small, sealed bottles of non-alcoholic whiskey essence from an online supplier, a harmless liquid with a strong scent identical to real alcohol. Perfectly legal, often used in baking. I wasn't planning to harm him. I just wanted to recreate what he'd done to me, swap perception for truth. But before that, I needed to be sure of his motive. I didn't want revenge based on assumptions. I wanted certainty. That proof came during a flight from Paris to New York. After landing, I overheard him in the crew bus talking to another captain about me. "She's back to playing hero," he said, laughing. I gave her one lesson, but some people never learn. Maybe I should remind her again. He wasn't afraid. He was planning to do it again. That night, I went home and replayed the memory of my suspension, the humiliation, the silence, the betrayal, and I knew this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about ending a cycle. If I didn't stop him, someone else would suffer the same fate. So I began tightening the plan. On every flight, I kept my behavior flawless. I smiled at him, took his request without hesitation, and even made small talk. I became predictable, someone he wouldn't suspect. That was the hardest part, pretending to trust him again, but I had to. During those weeks, I started noticing something strange. Other crew members were avoiding him more. Rumors were circulating that an anonymous complaint had reached headquarters again. He was getting restless, nervous even. Maybe he thought it was me. Maybe it was karma catching up. Either way, I knew the next time we flew together might be his breaking point. When our schedules finally aligned for the Madrid-Toronto route again, I stayed calm. My uniform was spotless, my hair perfect, my tone professional. Before boarding, I looked at him across the briefing room table and saw the faintest crack in his confidence. He avoided my eyes for the first time. That's when I knew I had him right where I wanted. This wasn't just about exposing a liar anymore. It was about reclaiming the version of myself he tried to destroy, the woman who once loved the skies without fear. And for that, I was ready to use the same stage he used against me, 35,000 feet above the world, where truth has nowhere to hide. The night of the crossing felt like an ordinary long haul at first. Passengers trickled through the boarding with the tired politeness of people who know they will sleep through most of the journey. The cabin lights dimmed to that half-dark you learn to love and hate. Outside, the tarmac blurred into black. Inside, the fluorescent glow of the galley and the hum of the ventilation were the only steady things. I moved through that space like a muscle memory. Safety demo, trolley checks, brief smiles, tiny gestures that keep strangers calm at 35,000 feet. Mark sat in the briefing with his back to the windows, the low light catching the edge of his wings. He kept that thermos on the table between his hands, the way some men hold a rosary. He made small talk, more to remind everyone he was there than to connect. When the pre-flight items were done, he glanced at me like I was a test he could pass or fail. There was a smugness that felt personal. I swallowed and finished the checklist. I had rehearsed every professional line I would need. Calm, polite, helpful. Service on night flights is quieter. We alter the routine so passengers can rest. It becomes a choreography of soft steps, careful movements, and hushed exchanges. That suited me. The darker the cabin, the easier it was to watch him without being obvious. He had a rhythm. Coffee after takeoff, a check of the flight log before cruise, a stretch when the seatbelt sign blinked for turbulence. He rarely came out of the cockpit for more than a few minutes. He trusted that rituals kept things safe, and he trusted his rituals more than anyone else. We reached the cruise, and I started my rounds. The plane was a ribbon of sleeping forms. I moved slowly, offering water and blankets, noting a cough here, a restless child there. When I reached the galley, my hands were steady. I kept the practiced smile that passengers respond to. The crew called out for hot beverages to the back. I made coffee, I filled cups, and I noticed Mark's thermos sitting at the ready on the cockpit ledge as I passed. What I planned next had been rehearsed in my head so many times it felt unreal. I had no intention of hurting anyone or causing a safety risk. I had one objective: create a moment where truth could be recorded, where his own words would tie the narrative together in a way paperwork never could. I believed then that it would be enough to tilt the scales. He stepped out just before the service cart reached row 20. The cockpit door clicked shut behind him. I could hear the faint rustle of his movement, the scrape of a chair, the low murmur of the other pilot's voice. That was when I moved. In the dim galley light, with the clink of cups and the soft whir of the trolley, I swapped the lid on his thermos with the one I had prepared. It was a simple, invisible act, my hands quick, clean, practiced. There is an intimacy to serving people in high places. No one sees the small, mundane things that might shift a life. I returned to my cart as if nothing had happened. The cabin felt ordinary, but there was a tension inside me like the stretch of a bowstring. For the next hour, I watched him in the periphery, the way he lifted the cup, the small nods he gave the first officer, the way he smoothed his uniform. He drank. He laughed with the co-pilot about a joke that had nothing to do with us. He was still the man who could write a report and end a career. Then, things changed. A flight attendant in the front galley called quietly to the cockpit. A few minutes later, the door opened and Mark came into the cabin with a look I had never seen on his face, sharp, falsified, angry. He moved with a purpose that cut through the slowness of the night. He approached the first officer, whose face had paled in a way that told me he was trying to read a script he hadn't written. The captain's voice carried just enough for the nearest rows to hear, an accusation phrased like a statement of fact. "I need you to tell the purser that I was served alcohol," he said. There was no question in it. He was already forming the shape of the story. That should have been the end of it. Another flight note, another suspension, more ruin. But as he spoke, something in the cockpit system did its job. The crew at the front exchanged looks. Protocols that had been ignored for a year were being remembered. The co-pilot hesitated in a way I would later learn meant he was listening for confirmation rather than delivering it. People woke up now. A woman in row 14 shifted, a child cried out, and the buzz of phones started to climb like a tide. The hum of normalcy was gone. Above the engines, the plane felt smaller. The aisle seemed longer. Passengers leaned forward. Eyes met. Somewhere, someone clicked a bell, readying for the turbulence they could not name. I kept working because stopping would make me look guilty. I kept my face a neutral mask, and inside I cataloged everything. The way his jaw tightened, the pause before he accused, the way the first officer's hands trembled when he reached for the interphone. I knew a political maneuver when I saw one. He was trying to manufacture evidence of my supposed instability by making me the unstable element of an otherwise routine flight. He had done it before. But this time, his accusation did not land as it had. The co-pilot, the crew, even two passengers who'd been in aviation spoke up with small, certain voices. "We heard him say he drank," one said. "He's the one who was drinking," another muttered. Something had shifted. The narrative was no longer obedient to the first person who spoke. The captain's face went white around the mouth. He tried to double down, to press his advantage, but now he was arguing against a room that was listening. I felt the cold, clean edge of the plan I had put into motion. It was not chaos, it was a revelation. And while it did not yet look like justice, the first fracture had appeared in the story he had built. That fracture would widen, but not tonight. Tonight, it was a seed planted in the dark. We would cross a vast stretch of ocean under radio silence and flickering stars. Everything that followed would be procedural, slow, and precise. For the first time since my world had been taken from me, I was not waiting to be defined by someone else's version of events. I was watching the moment truth found a place to begin. By the time we were halfway over the Atlantic, the cabin had gone quiet. The hum of the engines filled the silence like a heartbeat. The passengers were asleep, the lights dimmed to blue, and the only movement came from the slow drift of flight attendants checking the aisles. The air had that heavy, recycled stillness that always settles after midnight. Every sound seemed sharper, the click of the galley latch, the buzz of the intercom, the low whisper of air through the vents. I stood near the forward galley, pretending to check inventory, but my focus was fixed on the cockpit door. Behind it, Captain Donovan and the first officer were speaking in low voices, though I couldn't make out the words. It had been almost an hour since he took that first sip from his protein shake. The faint scent of the non-alcoholic whiskey essence, sharp and unmistakable, was already doing its job. When the interphone buzzed, I jumped slightly. "Alicia," came the voice of the purser, a woman named Heather, calm but tight. "Can you bring Captain Donovan another coffee, please?" My heart started to pound. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I steadied my breathing, poured a fresh cup, and carried it forward. Every step felt deliberate. The cabin was dark, except for the small overhead light near the cockpit. As I approached the door, the first officer opened it halfway, his expression uneasy. "He's not feeling well," he said under his breath. I could see Mark through the narrow opening. His tie was loosened and his eyes looked unfocused. He was rubbing his temples like a man trying to force himself awake. The co-pilot's voice was low, almost apologetic. "He says he's dizzy. Smells strange in here too." That was the moment everything tilted. The co-pilot's tone wasn't accusing, it was concerned, confused. And I could see the calculation in Mark's eyes, the sudden panic of a man realizing control was slipping. He was trying to play it off, laughing it away, saying he was fine, that maybe the coffee was too strong, that the air was dry. But the first officer wasn't convinced. He radioed back to the purser, quietly reporting a possible crew incapacitation. A protocol phrase, the kind that triggered automatic procedures. I stepped back into the galley, pretending to stay busy while my mind replayed every detail. The cockpit recorder would now be capturing everything, voices, tone, and conversation. If Mark tried to twist this, the truth would already be locked inside the system. He staggered out of the cockpit not long after, muttering something about getting fresh air. The flight deck door closed behind him, leaving the first officer alone inside. Mark walked toward the lavatory, passing me with that same crooked grin he used to wear when he thought he owned the room. Only this time, it faltered halfway. "You look nervous, Alicia," he said, voice lower than usual. "You didn't spike my drink, did you?" I met his eyes, calm, controlled. "You're the one who taught me never to touch another person's drink, Captain." He laughed, but it sounded wrong, strained, mechanical. "Funny," he said. "I don't remember that lesson." He disappeared into the lavatory, and for a moment, I just stood there, gripping the counter edge. The flight attendants at the back were whispering on the intercom, unsure what was happening. Heather came forward, her brow furrowed. "What's going on?" she asked. I lowered my voice. "He doesn't look right. You might want to call ahead for a medical check on landing." Her eyes flicked toward the cockpit. "Should we declare anything?" "Not yet," I said quietly. "Let's just monitor." The decision wasn't mine to make, but I knew how this needed to unfold. I didn't want to endanger anyone or cause a scene midair. What I wanted was truth, visible, undeniable, recorded. The first officer was now flying solo under official procedure, and Mark's behavior was being noted in real time. Minutes later, he emerged again, pale but angry now, trying to regain authority. He barked orders about communication logs and navigation checks, but the co-pilot's tone was firm, professional. "Captain, I've already logged the event," he said evenly. "For safety, I'll remain in control until we assess your condition." The look Mark gave him could have frozen fire, but he didn't argue. Not this time. I watched him slump back into his seat, his authority stripped away not by force, but by his own reputation, by the suspicion he had once created for me. The irony was almost cruel. The man who accused me of intoxication was now being questioned for the same. The hours dragged on. The plane crossed the black ocean beneath a full moon, a silver arc gliding through silence. I stayed awake, heart racing, waiting for turbulence, waiting for anything to distract me, but it never came. The night was eerily smooth, like fate itself was holding its breath. When the landing lights finally came on, and the first officer announced descent, the tension in the cabin broke. Passengers stirred, unaware of what had just unfolded above them. Mark stayed silent through the final approach, his hands resting on his lap, his face a blank mask. We touched down in Toronto just after dawn. The sky outside was washed in cold light and the terminal glowed in the distance. As we taxied to the gate, a quiet message came through the radio. Ground medical requested for crew evaluation. The purser had followed procedure. There was no going back now. After passengers disembarked, 2 airline officials and a medical officer boarded. The first officer stepped out first, gave his report in calm, clear words, and handed over the cockpit recorder. Mark tried to protest, claiming dehydration and jet lag, but the scent of whiskey essence still lingered faintly in the air, unmistakable to everyone nearby. He looked at me once before they escorted him off the plane. It wasn't rage I saw, it was confusion, the dawning realization that the story he used to control people had finally turned against him. He didn't know how it happened, how the narrative slipped through his fingers, but I did. I hadn't sabotaged him. I hadn't endangered anyone. I'd only mirrored what he once did to me, just enough to let the truth surface. The evidence was now in official hands, preserved in flight records, cockpit audio, and reports from multiple witnesses. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet satisfaction of balance. It wasn't revenge. It was justice unfolding naturally, without lies or manipulation. And as I stood there watching the authorities lead him away, I realized something. You don't have to destroy a man like that. You just have to let him taste the truth he tried to feed you. He'd framed me once. Tonight, he'd framed himself. When the investigation began, I thought it would vanish like all the others, smoothed over by the airline, quietly forgotten, the pilot reinstated after a stress evaluation. That was their pattern. But this time, things were different. The next morning, I was called into the operations office at Toronto Pearson. My uniform was still crisp, but my hands trembled slightly as I waited. Two officials entered, one from the airline's internal safety board, the other from the National Aviation Authority. Both looked serious. There was no small talk, no pretense of reassurance. They simply said, "We need a full account of what happened on Flight 247. I told them everything, but carefully. I didn't mention the essence, the preparation, the months of quiet planning. I stuck to facts. The captain appeared disoriented. The smell of alcohol was present. The first officer logged the event, and the purser followed safety protocol. My story matched the official flight report perfectly. They listened, took notes, and nodded. When they dismissed me, one of them said quietly, "You did the right thing following procedure." That sentence stayed with me. The right thing. It didn't feel like vindication yet, but it was the first time anyone from the company had said those words to me in years. Days passed. The crew was grounded pending review. Rumors spread fast. Pilots whispered about Donovan losing control. Attendants speculated about a setup. I kept my head down and waited. Then, on the fourth day, a call came from headquarters. They wanted me in Madrid for a full debrief. My stomach twisted. This was it, the same room, the same cold faces, the same questioning tone I'd endured when I was accused. Except this time, the tone had changed. When I entered the room, 3 investigators were already seated. One of them slid a small recorder across the table. "We've reviewed the cockpit audio," she said. "Would you like to hear a section?" I nodded. Though my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe, she pressed play. Mark's voice filled the room, slurred, defensive, erratic. "I told you, it's nothing. Shesho Babley spiked my drink, that's what she does. She's done it before." Then came the first officer's voice, steady and tired. "Captain, please calm down. You're on record. No one has touched your drink except you." The investigator paused the recording. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. They looked at me, studying my reaction. I kept my expression neutral, though inside I felt something break loose, a quiet, buried scream I'd held for over a year finally surfacing. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was released. When they dismissed me, one of them said, "We'll be in touch." A week later, word spread through the crew channels that Captain Donovan had been suspended indefinitely. 2 weeks later, it became permanent. The official statement cited breach of safety protocol and unprofessional conduct. Behind closed doors, everyone knew the truth. He had lost control of his own narrative. After his dismissal, other stories started to surface. Marissa came forward first, the attendant he once cornered in Athens, then Elena, then 2 more women from different bases. They all said the same thing: harassment, threats, manipulation, and silence. For years, he had gotten away with it because no one dared to challenge a captain's authority. When HR finally reopened my old case file, I received an email that nearly made me cry. It said, "Your 2023 suspension has been reclassified as an administrative error. The company formally apologizes for the distress caused." No statement, no press release, no public clearing of my name, but it was enough. My record was clean again. Still, I didn't celebrate. Revenge hadn't brought peace. Truth had. But it was a quiet, lonely kind of truth. The kind that doesn't erase the damage, just stops it from spreading further. A few months later, I was assigned to a training role, mentoring recruits. On my first day, one of the trainees, a nervous young woman barely out of her 20s, asked me, "Is it true you once stood up to a captain?" I smiled faintly. "No," I said. "I just stopped pretending fear was part of the uniform." The room laughed softly, but she understood. I could see it in her eyes. That night, after my shift, I sat by the airport windows, watching a 787 lift off into the dark. The reflection of the plane's taillight flickered against the glass, and I thought about everything that had happened: the false accusation, the humiliation, the quiet planning, the moment above the clouds when truth finally took its place. I realized I hadn't ruined him. He'd done that to himself. All I did was open the door and let his own lies walk out into the light. Sometimes justice doesn't look heroic. It doesn't come with applause or revenge speeches. Sometimes it's as simple as someone seeing you clearly again after believing the worst. The sky still felt like home, but in a different way now. Before, I used to look up and see freedom. Now I saw clarity, endless, cold, and honest. Before boarding my next flight, I caught my reflection in the galley window. Same uniform, same wings pinned to my chest. But this time, they didn't feel like a costume I had to defend. They felt earned. And as the engines roared and we lifted into the night, I whispered to myself, "You took my name once, Mark, but I took back the sky." The truth finally came full circle. After years of silence, manipulation, and humiliation, Clara didn't just clear her name. She dismantled the illusion of power that had kept so many others quiet. Mark Donovan's downfall wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was methodical, inevitable, and built on his own arrogance. What started as one woman's quiet act of defiance ended up exposing years of misconduct that had thrived behind cockpit doors. For Clara, it was never about revenge anymore. By the time the investigation ended, she had seen how revenge only mirrors the cruelty that started it. What she wanted was something simpler: accountability, truth, and the right to look at herself again without shame. The company's apology didn't undo the past, but it gave her back her dignity. She learned that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it looks like patience, like silence, like walking into a room full of people who once doubted you and standing tall anyway. Months later, she returned to the skies, not as a broken attendant seeking justice, but as someone who had finally made peace with it. Every flight reminded her that no matter how dark things get, truth always finds altitude. It may not arrive fast, but it always climbs. As the aircraft soared above the clouds, Clara realized she had reclaimed more than her career. She had reclaimed her story. The sky that once felt like a battleground was hers again, vast and open, free from the shadows that used to haunt her.